Good afternoon, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Jake Polkin, along with my wife, Joanne, who's sitting in the front row. We co-chair the Alumni Club here, as well as the Alumni Schools Committee for the state. And we want to welcome you for joining us this afternoon for the annual Harper Lecture. We both graduated from the college in 1989. My wife got her degree in psychology. Back then it was called behavioral science. And I got my bachelor's in political science. And I'm glad that you all could join us this afternoon again for the Harper Lecture. Let me just take a quick moment to recognize Rich. I got to pause for a second so I can get it right. Oliver, did I get it right?
Very good.
There you are. I've been practicing that for about the last 45 minutes. From our local alumni club board, and he's visiting us actually from Benson, made the long trip, as well as everyone here representing the Alumni Board of Governors, the Alumni Schools Committee, and the Phoenix, Chicago, and Harper Society members who have joined us. Their leadership and all of your support makes these events, such as the annual Harper Lecture and our other alumni events, possible. So thank you for joining us. I'm now going to dive right in and introduce our speaker today and this year, Professor Robbert P. Pippin. Professor Pippin is the Evelyn, and this one I'm going to struggle with, Stefansson?
Exactly.
Stefansson, Neff Distinguished Service Professor in the Committee on Social Thought, the Department of Philosophy, and the College at U Chicago, or the U of C, as many of us fondly call it. I'm still struggling with U Chicago these days. Am I the only one, by the way?
No.
Okay.
I still say U of C.
I still say U of C. Thank you. I feel much better. Professor Pippin has written several books and articles on German idealism and later German philosophy, and he's also published articles on political philosophy, theories of self-consciousness, the nature of conceptual change, and the problem of freedom. He is a winner of the Mellon Distinguished Achievement Award in the Humanities, a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and a member of the American Philosophical Society. And without further ado, please give him a warm welcome for today's Harper Lecture.
Thank you very much. Thank you for coming. You can imagine how grateful I am to be out of Chicago for a day. I wish it could be a week. I love doing these events, and I'm looking forward to our discussion, so I'll try to keep the talk under 50 minutes or so we have 20 minutes or half an hour for discussion. Let me say something first, since you've heard that my main field is German philosophy, why I'm lecturing to you on a Hollywood Western from 1962. I also work on political philosophy, and contemporary Anglophone political philosophy is mostly dedicated to one question. It's about the legitimacy of the use of state power. That is, what kind of argument would justify the use of the state's monopoly on coercive violence against citizens who might, in their individual cases, be unwilling. So it's a classic political problem, what justifies the authority of the state. But I got dissatisfied with the fact that this is a very narrow approach to a whole set of issues in politics that used to be a much more prominent feature of the classical political philosophy tradition, what I call in general the problems of political psychology. The main problem is a simple one. How is it possible to create sufficient allegiance to some common entity or some common good that it can override, in cases where it has to, the attachment people have to their own family, to their own loved ones, to their own extended family, to their own community, as opposed to the larger community. They don't do that. That is to say, this isn't established by virtue of their acceptance of an argument. I think we all realize that. The process by which political allegiance is created and sustained is much more complicated than them hearing a good argument and believing in it. It's even more complicated because it's extremely difficult. The erotic attachment we have to those things that we regard as our own is extremely powerful, and the connection we have to something like the state is much more abstract. So there's a whole host of political passions and desires, that is, the passions and desires that are relevant to politics, that have to be discussed. Things like the search for glory, pride, all kinds of passions revolving around self-worth or self-esteem, hatred of injustice conceived in a way that might not be shared by others, very complex swirl of passions and desires that have to be in some way educated so that politics can be possible. And I didn't see these really classic issues in Plato and Aristotle, in Rousseau, Locke, Hobbes, Hegel, Marx, Nietzsche. I didn't see those quite prominent anymore in contemporary discussions of political psychology. Political psychology exists, but it exists in psychology and sociology departments, and it essentially is a matter of polling people to find out which type of person in what sort of psychological category votes for that type of person and what gets this person excited and this other person not excited. But I conceived the idea that some of the great Hollywood Westerns from the period where there were great Hollywood Westerns, roughly from around 1939 and John Ford's wonderful classic Western Stagecoach until about the mid-1960s when they stopped being made. There were 7,000 Westerns made during that period, and most of them are terrible. So I'm not here to tell you that everybody should be running out and watching Westerns. 95% of them are pretty bad. They're cowboy action movies for basically geared towards adolescent males. But there are 20 or 25 by directors like John Ford or Howard Hawks or Bud Bedecker or any number of Anthony Mann, any number of other directors that are, I think, great works of art. They're not objects of commercial interest only. And it occurred to me that these Westerns also embody a kind of narration that we could fairly call mythic. That is to say, they all often revolve around a certain set of standard plots, a kind of a mythic repetition of a basic problem. And the one that interested me that's in many, many great Westerns is the problem of founding. How do we get from a situation of lawlessness or near lawlessness, which is the case in many Westerns, to a community that's organized around the rule of law? And especially, what is psychologically necessary for people to have to come to accept the rule of law and, say, the so-called bourgeois virtues of prudence, security, moderation, compromise, in a situation where the heroic virtues, like glory, honor, integrity, and violence, to enforce it, are much more important in order to survive. So many of the great Westerns are about this theme of founding. And it's particularly important in the United States that this mythic problem be given a treatment, because the great American experiment, that is, that you could form a political unit on the basis of allegiance to a common set of ideas. That's about all we share as Americans, given how diverse a society we are. The idea that there could be a successful modern political unit like that failed. It failed in a catastrophic, fratricidal, bloody civil war. And what's also interesting about a lot of Westerns, especially this one and some others by Ford, is that the refounding of the nation took place in the West. And the question of whether the refounding, on the basis of the principles that originally, in some historical sense, failed, is alive in many of these Westerns and is treated with an enormous amount of intelligence and subtlety in the very best ones. And America's not a very old country, and our myths aren't very old, just a couple of hundred years ago. But as a German commentator on Hollywood Westerns once put it, well, the Germans have the Nibelungslied, the Song of the Nibelung, as their mythic story. The English have the Arthurian legends. The Spanish have El Cid. The Romans had the Aeneid. The Americans have John Ford. And that's pretty good company to be in, and I was convinced by it, that this mythic treatment of a very basic problem inflected in the American context, especially in this context of this sort of refounding, was a crucial question for many of these Westerns. The question was the one Rousseau put in his first discourse in the 18th century. He said, we have astronomers, physicians, chemists, poets. What we don't have anymore are citizens. And so a central question in Westerns is whether the reformation of the polity after the Civil War could produce citizens. So I want to show you a scene first from another Western, one I'm sure most of you have seen, High Noon, Fred Zinnemann's great Western made during the McCarthy period, and politically charged Western starring Gary Cooper as Marshall Kane, and Grace Kelly as his wife, Amy. As many of you remember from the plot, Kane had sent 3 murderous thugs to jail. Somehow or another they were pardoned or they got out, and they're coming to town at noon to kill him. So the movie is the first one that has the time of the movie coincident with the time of the events. The movie's an hour and a half long, and the events are an hour and a half long. But he asks the townspeople collectively for help, rather than run away and have them chase him down and kill him. And they refuse. They are united in various respects. The most significant act of refusal occurs in a church where they're gathered to consider whether they want to help him, and they don't. But the main reason they don't want to help him is commercial. They think that having the reputation as a town with a bloody fight in its main street is a bad one, so they abandon him, and they leave him to face the 3 alone, which he does, and of course it's Gary Cooper. He kills them all. But he kills them all with the help of his wife, who, interestingly enough, is a devout Quaker, a pacifist. But she helps him shoot one of the outlaws in the back and kill another one by assisting Gary Cooper in killing him. So the scene I'm going to show you is the last scene in the film, and you'll see right away how prominent this question is, because there's a wonderful shot by Zinnemann of these conflicting loyalties. You'll see the star representing the civic authority that Gary Cooper's character is supposed to represent, and then a pan around to see the wedding ring on her hand. And we know immediately that what made it possible for these people to be defeated was not a political bond, but a private one, the marriage bond. And so I think it's fair to say that the answer to this movie, to the questions I've been posing, is a skeptical one. There's the star. That'll go away in a minute. And there's the wedding ring. And then he does something for a Western that's supposed to be such a patriotic genre that's quite shocking, and was shocking in the 50s. Now, relying on private bonds like that is one way to build a common polity around certain kind of self-interest that has to do with the safety of your family. But as you can see, it's quite a strong expression of skepticism about the reality of what we profess to be the political bond that unites us, given what Gary Cooper had experienced. And that question of the nature of the bond that we need to have a founding is the central question of John Ford's last great work of genius in 1962, The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance. John Ford, as you may know, won 4 Academy Awards, but none of them for Westerns, even though that was the genre he identified with. When asked what he did, he said, "I make Westerns." Nasty man, John Ford, probably the meanest person to ever work in Hollywood. When they regularly would ask him questions like, what brought you to Hollywood? The train. That kind of person. Not a likable man, but probably the smartest person who ever made movies in Hollywood. Well, Liberty Valance tells a story through a flashback. We'll see the first scene that sets up the flashback. But a prominent senator, probably the next vice presidential candidate, Ransom Stoddard, played by Jimmy Stewart, has returned to town with his wife, Hallie. There's an aura of sadness about that moment, which we'll see. But during the course of the narration, to make the point about the theme of the movie, we'll skip ahead to his narration of what Shinbone, a town in the West somewhere, most people think probably in Colorado, right before statehood, a scene where we see what the early Shinbone was like prior to the coming of Law and Order, which is represented in the movie by Rance Stoddard, or Jimmy Stewart's character. This is the old Shinbone, and it's a very familiar Western scene. Also note the prominence of the ethnic mixing in the town, which we won't see later, believe me. The women are not censorious judges. They find this amusing. And then you'll see the emphasis on the equal status of the Mexican population with their bars, prostitutes, and so forth. Okay, so that's the old shinbone that we learn about in the course of the movie. And what I'll show you now is the new shinbone that begins the movie. And you'll see it's quite deliberately a kind of contrast. Even the lighting is different. John Ford never shot indoors until this movie. This is a set. Very unusual way for him to film.
Thank you, Jason. On time. You bet.
Town's efficient, punctual, trains on time, clean, orderly.
Link apple, yeah.
Oh, Miss Hallie.
Hello, Marshal.
Howdy, Mr. Senator.
No, Rance.
Rance? Sure glad you could come.
Well, your wire caught us in St. Louis. I want to thank you.
That's my buckboard's right over there. Here now. Jason, give me that box.
You know all the time they were coming. Well, now that's the first time in your life you ever kept a secret. Blabbermouth.
Who was that, Jason? Anybody I get a line or two in the paper about?
A line or two? Well, you blasted young fool, that Senator Stoddard and his wife. Well, you could fill your newspaper with them.
Modern, telephone. You'll see it even has a credit economy.
This is Charlie Hasbrook. Emergency. Look, call the office and tell the editor that Senator Stoddard and his wife just got off the train. Yeah, that's right. Thanks, honey.
Hey, Bub, that's a nickel.
Charge it to the Shinbone Star.
So, I mean, not only is there a kind of appropriate melancholy because a man has died, which we find out very soon, but the whole town seems melancholic. There's this kind of stillness, airlessness to the place. The contrast with the old Shinbone is quite striking. It's as if in order to save the town, we had to kill it, kill the life out of it. Naturally, there's an air of melancholy because an old friend of theirs, the John Wayne character, Tom Donovan, has died. And they heard about it when they were in St. Louis and came quickly back to Shinbone. As you've already just seen a little bit of, but you'll see some more of it, Jimmy Stewart as a politician, very, very different from the man we're going to see through most of the movie, the young Ransom Stoddard. He's a bit pompous, speechifying, always in a kind of public persona. And the local press, treating him as a celebrity, the way politicians are now treated, wants a story, and they demand it as the people's right to know, whereas it's obvious that they simply want to sell more newspapers and they have an interesting story to tell. And Rance looks at Hallie and she gives him permission. She said, all right, you stay and talk to the politicians. I'm going to go out and visit Tom Donovan's ranch. And the scene is more like the visit to an ancient ruin. Very sad, very melancholic. And Ransom Stoddard goes off to tell the newspaper people, the editor and the other reporters, what happened when he was a young man in Shinbone. And that's the story we see. We don't know very much at the beginning about Tom Donovan except that he's been completely forgotten. They don't know who he is. They don't know anything about his bearing on the story of Ransom Stoddard. That's the great mystery for them, and they want that explained. And so he begins to tell them the story, and the flashback starts, as is very common in a lot of film. This is the beginning of the flashback when he arrives in Shinbone, and you'll see Liberty Valance very soon, played by, and I think undoubtedly his greatest role, maybe in Fritz Lang's movie The Big Heat, he's just as good, but this is Lee Marvin at his best. Something almost over the top in the dandyish kind of sadism that he represents in the movie. But you'll also see right away that during the robbery, we also get another symbolic scene about the problem of law and the authority of law in a community where there isn't, in effect, any collective allegiance to it yet. So here's the first scene.
Will you take your hands off? What kind of men are you?
This kind, dude.
It's also the first use of dude frequently in a movie. So maybe
Now,
that's
what kind of man are you, dude?
I'm an attorney at law, and I'm duly licensed with the territory. And you may have us and your guns now, but I'll see you in jail for this.
Jail?
I edited this together a little to make it shorter.
Here, put that stuff in here and get to your horses. Hurry.
I'm sorry about the violence. This is 62, so you'd think it'd be safe to show publicly.
Lawyer, huh? Well, I'll teach you law. Western law.
Come on, let's get out of here. Come on. Come on.
So, Tom Donovan, the John Wayne character, whom we'll see soon, rides by in his buckboard and finds Rand Stoddard and brings him back to Shinbone to a restaurant run by a couple named the Ericksons. They have a daughter named Hallie, played by Vera Miles. And they nurse Rance back to health. He's very badly beaten, obviously. And he demands to pay off his debt to them in service at the restaurant. So he waits on tables with an apron. And of course, in the stereotypes of the day, or maybe even not of the day, but of more recent times, that feminizes him. And we have this association of the rule of reason and law with femininity, as given the contrast with the kind of masculinity that Liberty Valance and Tom Donovan represent. There's a scene in which he's waiting on tables and Liberty Valance comes in and trips him as he brings John Wayne his steak. Steak goes on the floor. Valance insists that he pick it up. And John Wayne intervenes and said, "It was my steak, you pick it up," to Liberty Valance. And Rance Stoddard is horrified. They're about to kill each other over who picks up a steak. This is, in a way, a kind of perfect example of the problem Thomas Hobbes in the 17th century talked about when he talked about the dangers to a modern commercial regime. The desire for glory, for vainglory, according to Hobbes, is a very dangerous, stupid thing. Because obviously the greatest good in human life is staying alive, because you can't do anything else of any value unless you're alive. So Hobbes is a perfect representative of a kind of very minimalist secular rationality. The first thing we all ought to be trying to do is not kill each other. And the ethic of integrity, authenticity, honor, and so forth is very dangerous to such an assumption, because people who believe in that code believe there are situations in which it's not worth being alive if you have to live with the stain of dishonor on you. So Vance and Tom Donovan represent this kind of pre-modern cultural enactment of the very thing Rance Stoddard is trying to stop. So he says, "Damn it, I'll pick up the steak." And he does. He picks up the steak and stops the fight. All of which will raise a question for us later, because if you've seen the movie, you know that Valance later agrees to one of these pre-modern duels with Liberty Valance in a way that's not very secure looking for him, because he's incompetent with a gun. It also raises a question about Tom Donovan. We learn fairly quickly that this John Wayne character is easily, within 1,000 miles, the only person good enough with a gun to take on Liberty Valance and the men who hire him. He's hired by the so-called cattle ranchers north of the picket wire. And these are people, the perennial villains in the United States, but this conflict will perhaps mean something to you here in Arizona. They're the people in Westerns who don't want the state. They don't want regulation, they don't want law, they don't want fences, they don't want cattle grazing regulations, and they're willing to hire Liberty Valance and his band of thugs to intimidate and terrify the population so that they won't vote for statehood, so that they'll lay low and let them continue to have free range over all of the lands that they control. That's the idea behind Liberty Valance's presence in the town. He's supposed to stop that. But the only person who can clearly stop him, outdraw him in the classic Western way, is John Wayne, Tom Donovan. Why doesn't he do it? Rid the town of Valance. Well, he does it in a way for a reason that associates him again with this pre-modern code, because he has complete faith in his own self-sufficiency. He can defend his own ranch. That's all that's important. He has no attachment to the common. Why should he, is his way of thinking. These are like people who think, if everybody had a gun, we wouldn't need the police. And it's very much like that with John Wayne. He thinks that there is no reason for me to be committed to anything other than what I can protect. And I have no real allegiance to anything belonging to other people. That's their thing. And that's not really something that changes in the movie, but Ford allows us to see that it's a certain kind of delusion, because we see several times in the film that Wayne would be in a lot of trouble without that man. That's Woody Strode, the great actor who played in a lot of Ford movies, playing Pompey, his assistant, called in the movie, of course, his boy. This is a scene in which, once Ransom's come to town, he's going to civilize everybody. He wants to teach them reading and writing. He wants to teach them American history. So he has a class very quickly set up to teach American history. And as I say, Tom Donovan doesn't really acknowledge in the proper way his dependence on Pompey. He has this mythology about himself as supreme self-sufficiency and independence. But we see it, and Ford is letting us see it because he's clearly trying to suggest that the collective American dependence on those whom they will not acknowledge is something we ought to see, to confront. So this also has a marvelous line reading by Woody Strode as he tries to remember in this scene what he's supposed to remember, and what he can't remember is obviously very significant.
It was writ by Mr. Thomas Jefferson of Virginia.
Was written, Pompey.
Written by Mr. Thomas Jefferson. And he called it the Constitution.
Declaration of Independence.
It begun with the words, we hold these truths to be self-evident.
Let him alone, Charlie.
Self-evident that
all men are created equal. That's fine, Pompey.
I knew that, Mr. Rance, but I just plumb forgot it.
Oh, that's all right, Pompey. A lot of people forget that part of it.
And a scene right after this, John Wayne comes in and tears him out of the classroom. It's a waste of time. You have to come with me and help me on my horse ranch. From here on out, the main plot in the movie for a long time is romantic. Tom Donovan has been building a small horse ranch outside of town, clearly intending to marry Hallie and begin this private life together on the horse ranch. But with Ransom Stoddard in town, everything has changed. Of course, he's the cultivated hero. He's going to teach her to read and write. He's going to teach her about the wider world. It would be a separate digression to discuss this format in Hollywood movies. But by Hollywood movies, by the way, I mean movies made in the 30s and 40s up until 1948 and a little bit afterward, when the Supreme Court took away the 5 big movie companies' monopoly on the theater houses in which they were shown. So the movie companies, given that in the 40s especially, 40 million people a week went to the movies. Virtually half the country went to a movie every week. They were guaranteed making money because they owned the theaters. They always showed a double feature, and a lot of the Westerns were the second feature, the B movies. But this, in a lot of these movies, the triangle I'm talking about, a woman who is torn between a bad boy, a violent, sexy, charismatic, but dangerous man, and a good boy civilized, rule of law, got a good job, headed for a good future. That is so prominent in Hollywood movies, there are several books written about it. And those of you who know classic Hollywood movies, perhaps the most famous example is Casablanca, in which Ingrid Bergman has to decide between Rick and Paul Honreid, who is playing the Jimmy Stewart character in Casablanca. Anyway, the bad guy usually never stands a chance. The girl usually marries or goes with the good guy and then regrets for the rest of her life that she didn't go with the bad guy. That's also a feature, and that's what happens in effect in this movie. But the sort of culmination of the actual plot in the flashback occurs after a particularly violent episode that Valance perpetrates that we'll see. And he's called out Ransom Stoddard to a duel, and everyone is encouraging Rance to leave. That you can't possibly do anything but get killed by taking on Liberty Valance. But he does. He takes an old rickety handgun that wouldn't hit the proverbial side of a barn, and goes out to face him. It's clear that he's going to get killed, and so Hallie knows this, and she begs Tom to help, which is not a very good choice for Tom, because if he does help and saves Valance and saves Ransom, he'll get Hallie, and if he doesn't help and Ransom gets killed, he gets Hallie, but under this shadow of not having helped and letting him get killed. So he does help. And at exactly the same moment that the two guns between Ransom and Valance go off, he's hiding in the dark in an alley, violating every code of the West, and shoots down Liberty Valance with a rifle in cold blood. And he says at one point, cold-blooded murder, but I can live with it. Hallie's happy. But again, interestingly, the defeat of the lawlessness that makes civilized order possible is itself unjust, immoral, indefensible. But if it had been the force of morality and justice that had attempted to shoot Liberty Valance, he would have failed. So it raises a very complicated question. For some European political philosophers who I think go a little too far with this, it means that all civilized order is based not only on an original unjust act of violence, but continually rests on such suppression and violence. That seems to me to go a little far. But that's the basic idea that we see happen in the duel. And it's important for the town. If the death had been an open fight between Tom Donovan and Liberty Valance, it would have just been another episode in the endless cycle of private violence and revenge. It must be that Ransom Stoddard killed Liberty Valance, and the death of the outlaw must mean that the force of reason, order, and law prevailed, wasn't defeated. Here's of course, and it's very interesting that that's not true, but it's what the state was based on. Here's the scene, the duel. I think it's important here, I'll just say, the profession of professor is usually not held in regard as a heroic, charismatic, romantic field, and you'll see that in this scene, what they call him. That's his law shingle. He realizes there's no law. There's just violence.
Well, Mr. Professor, I thought you left town. What are you doing out here?
I'm waiting for Liberty Valance. Why doesn't he come out?
Well, that's none of our business.
You all heard him say he had a gun in his hand, didn't you?
I didn't say that.
That ain't murder, Mr. Marshall. That's a clean-cut case of self-defense. You heard him call me out, didn't you, Tin Horn? Well, didn't you? Now get out of my way. I say you out here!
I'd say that was Liberty Valance there now. Wouldn't you?
Yes, it would.
We'll be seeing you, Mr. Stoddard.
Come closer where I can see you. Get out of that shadow, dude. You got two hands, eye slinger. Pick it up. All right, dude. This time, right between the eyes.
It's interesting, this is what we see first. We don't know the truth yet. Now, as the process, this is a great victory for the forces of law and order. After it happens, the movement towards statehood gathers momentum, and the ranchers have clearly come close to losing. And there's a convention that's going to choose a delegate to the state constitution writing, and Rance is nominated, but he declines because he's dishonored by the fact that he's known and admired for killing a man. And he thinks this stain of immorality makes him an unfit legislator. He doesn't represent the right values. So he stomps out, and John Wayne follows him. And in the revelation scene that is the core of the movie, tells him what really happened, and that's this scene.
Valance couldn't make the runaway. What is it now, Pilgrim? Your conscience?
Isn't it enough to kill a man without trying to build a life on it?
You talk too much. Think too much. Besides, you didn't kill Liberty Valance.
What?
Think back, Pilgrim.
It's the first movie where he uses that. That's so associated with Wayne.
Valance came out of the saloon. You were walking toward him when he fired his first shot. Remember?
This time, right between the eyes.
Tom, why did you do it? Why?
Cold-blooded murder. But I can live with it. Hallie's happy. She wanted you alive.
But you saved my life.
I wish I had. Hallie's your girl now. Go on on back in there and take that nomination. You taught her how to read and write. Now give her something to read and write about.
This is really the end of John Wayne's role in the movie. He disappears. We don't see him again, except for one last scene where he goes back to the ranch he's been building and burns it down, and almost burns himself in the gets in it, turns it on fire, and almost burns himself up. Poppy has to go in and drag him out at the last minute. His life is ruined. His dream of a private life with Hallie is over. He knows she's going to go away with him, and he has this on his conscience for the rest of his life. And we learn later that he becomes an unknown man. He never puts his guns on again, never is prominent in the town, just sort of disappears. That's why they can't understand why Rance and his wife are coming back after Tom dies. But this scene is unusual. You've seen that Rance changes his mind, but what happened? I mean, he was unwilling to be a delegate because he thought that he was known for being the man who killed Liberty Valance. Now he finds out that Valance was murdered, and that his role in it is popularly believed to be something that's false. He doesn't go back in there and say, it's all right, I didn't kill him. He accepts the legend that he killed Liberty Valance. So he's willing to not live with the moral compromise of having shot him in a duel, but he is willing to live with a lie and with a murder. It's very, very puzzling. Why? Is he impressed with the enormity of Tom's sacrifice for Hallie? Is he convinced that some compromise with this moral purity he'd been insisting on is necessary? Is his ambition fired up now that he thinks he doesn't have to portray himself as the man who killed Liberty Valance? Well, this is the end of the flashback too, and we go back to the present. And there's a very famous scene at the end that I'm going to show you, but I've cut in some other scenes from parts of the movie that have to do simply with paper, because the last scene that's so famous involves the paper on which this true story that is now out for the first time has been written down. You're going to see what happens to it. But I also wanted to emphasize how much Ford has been building up to that scene with other scenes in which something written down purported to be the truth or the law plays a role in the movie. So first we'll see the terrible scene from the beginning, and then two other scenes, and then the final scene that is probably the most famous of all of Ford's endings. This you've seen before, but it's important to keep the paper in mind as we see the rest of it. This gesture will be repeated at the end of the movie. This gesture of discarding the paper.
Lawyer, huh?
Liberty Valance. And his myrmidons.
That's a reference to Homer. What that's doing in a Western, I don't know.
Liberty Valance taking liberties with the liberty of the press.
Had your supper yet, Peabody?
My supper? No, it's a splendid idea.
Well, you can start by eating this.
That's a poor joke. Eat it! Eat it! Eat it! Eat it!
I came here with a carefully prepared speech. But this is no time for oratory. Let me speak to you from the heart. I come before you.
Back again to the Senate, and a man who, with a snap of his fingers, could be the next Vice President of the United States.
You're not going to use the story, Mr. Scott?
No, sir. This is the West, sir. When the legend becomes fact, print the legend. He's right, Vance.
Well, Ford took a lot of criticism for that. The ending of Fort Apache is the same sort of thing. He took a lot of criticism as if he were saying America needs a kind of mythology, whether it's true or false. But that criticism is in a way pretty thoughtless. We've just seen a movie that shows us that the legend is not fact. So if Ford wanted to insist that we need heroizing mythological legends, why would he show us that it's not true? Are we, by some kind of elite, not supposed to be bothered by it the way other people were? And even so, you can't make yourself believe a legend that isn't fact just because you think you ought to. You can't will yourself to believe something. I mean, you could exercise with the students. I'll give you $1 million if you can actually believe there's an elephant right there. You can't, no matter how strong the willpower and how important it is for you to believe it. So it's a very peculiar phrase, when the legend becomes fact. What does that mean, when the legend becomes fact? The first and most simplistic reading is when the legend becomes something that everyone needs to believe and does believe, then print that. But that doesn't mean when the legend becomes fact. He could have said, when the legend becomes so important to a community, stick with the legend. He doesn't say that. He says, when the legend becomes fact. We'll return to this. Stoddard and his wife then leave, and in a way that's often unnoticed, they leave without attending the funeral. They're busy people. They have somewhere to go. They pay one last visit, you see the end of it here, to the coffin. Hallie has gone out to the ranch and got a cactus rose and brought it back and put it on the cactus. That's a theme through the movie too, like any great work of literature. At the beginning, when he and Hallie are first together and they see a cactus rose, he says, I'll take you somewhere where we can see real roses, as if the cactus rose in the desert is not a real rose, as if cultivated roses are the only real, gets everything exactly backwards, in other words. The desert has plenty of roses, and Hallie could have stayed in the desert. And as you'll see, it's something she's been thinking about quite a lot herself. And then we see them on the train as they rush away, and we see another morally interesting and ambiguous scene, the last one I'll show.
Hallie, would you be too sorry if once I get the new irrigation bill through, would you be too sorry if we just up and left Washington? I sort of have a hankering to come back here to live. Maybe open up a law office.
Rance. If you knew how often I dreamed of it. My roots are here. I guess my heart is here. Yes, let's come back. Look at it. It was once a wilderness. Now it's a garden. Aren't you proud?
Hallie, who put the cactus roses on Tom's coffin?
I did.
Sorry to interrupt. One of the things that's most interesting about this movie is the question, you may have formed your opinion of this already, does Hallie know the real truth? Does she know that Liberty Valance was killed by Tom, or does she believe the legend? There's a slight tick in her face, I don't know if you can see it well enough, to get some sense of what the answer to that question is.
I got a brand new spittoon for you, Cuspidor, Hallie. And Luke the engineer's got a full head of steam in this old tar bucket. We're gonna make 25 miles an hour bust a boiler trying. And we wired ahead to Junction City. They're gonna hold the express for you. Rance, in 2 days and 2 nights, you're gonna be right back in Washington.
Oh, thank you, Jason. Thank you, and I'm going to write a letter to the officials of this railroad and thank them for their kindness and for going to all this trouble.
You think nothing of it. Nothing's too good for the man who shot Liberty Valance.
Hard to tell. A lot of things in that scene. Aren't you proud? It's a deeper question than just aren't you proud of what you've done as a legislator. It means as deep a question as it can be. Technologically advanced, legally complicated, culturally sophisticated modernity. Aren't you proud? As if it's an ambiguous question. As if something has been sacrificed or lost in the efficiency and coldness and commercialization and celebritizing of the modern shin bone. Secondly, when she asks, aren't you proud, he doesn't answer. What he's worried about is who put the cactus rose on Tom's coffin. Well, who else? I mean, they've traveled from St. Louis. You remember the first scene with this huge empty hat box that she's brought for no other purpose than to get the cactus rose and put it. He's never asked her, what the hell is the hand box for, and the hat box for, and what did you do with it? And but the question resonates with a kind of pathos and sadness in the movie. It's rather like, and Ford, being Irish, would know this, rather like James Joyce's story, The Dead, where a man discovers that the wife he'd loved all his life and that he thought loved him actually had loved another man all their marriage. And you get the sense that Ransom Stoddard has some inkling that not only is his public life built on a lie, the legend that he shot Liberty Valance, which we hear such a deeply ironic way in the end, but that his marriage may have been a lie, that the conventional bonds that we saw in High Noon are quite powerful, might not even have existed in his own marriage, and he blows out this match as if something in his illusions about himself has been extinguished. It's a very sad gesture. But I think in summation, one thing we can say about that elegiac and melancholic tone at the end is that The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance is a tragedy, and the subject of the tragedy is Tom Donovan, a man who made possible what Rance is a little rightly hesitant to take credit for in answering the aren't you proud question. Because if we were being honest, all of us, the man responsible for the modern shin bone is Tom Donovan on one reading. Get to the other reading in a minute. And Donovan represents one of those individuals whose sacrifices and a certain kind of selflessness go unreported in history and sink into a kind of oblivion that the public mythology about the founding, our own mythology, for example, about Washington and Jefferson and Madison, and the kinds of stuff that's still very alive in the country. How do we teach this history? What's the right tone to take with respect to it? How deflating and demythologizing ought it to be? How heroizing and mythological ought it to be? For someone like Tom Donovan, there is no such story or legend. He's just completely forgotten. And I think that, for me, that's the most sad part of the movie. Not so much that the founding was based on an act of violence, but that the heroizing we need doesn't correspond to the reality that actually produced the civilized order that Shinbone has become. Aside from the fact that there's also this little footnote on whether it's all that good that modern Shinbone has so little life left in it and is so segregated and quite literally white at the end of the movie. But one last word on Rance, and then I'll stop. We can't be too hard on him. First of all, he's an extraordinarily brave man. He faces down Liberty Valance knowing he's going to die. And he does it as a matter of personal principle. There's no strategy here connected to the law. But those philosophers who think that the state exists by virtue of some founding act of violence, as if there's some moment in time when everything afterwards is shadowed by it, I think that's quite wrong as a philosophical principle. In some sense, Liberty Valance is the man who shot, Ransom Stoddard is the man who shot Liberty Valance. He's the one who made possible the elimination of the kind of life that Valance represents, the life of violence and barbarism the strongest as the one who rules. He worked hard for that his whole life. Ford isn't very fond of politicians, and they're usually joked about in his movies, like the Basil Rathbone character with the phony white paper. That's the typical, and the Ransom Stoddard pomposity at the beginning of the movie, the speechifying. That's very common in Ford. But on the other hand, Ransom Stoddard was a very brave man, and in a much more extended sense, given what Tom Donovan made possible in the beginning, in a more extended sense, he probably is the man who killed, who shot, who eliminated Liberty Valance. Thanks for your attention. I hope we have some time for questions. So I gather we can have some questions. I'm happy to, or just comments, anything you'd like to talk about or say about the movie. Even if you don't like it, you can say that, yeah.
Why did he do it on a set in black and white?
I think he wanted to communicate this idea of airlessness, of super civilized life, not even outside. So there's no other Ford Western with any scene like that first scene, which has such an air of sterility and super cleanliness in a way, and order. So just because it's so unusual, I think he's really emphasizing, to the point of exaggerating, what has been lost in the old shinbone. The old shinbone was also a place of mutual aid. As soon as Rance is found, he's brought back to the Ericksons. They take care of him, as opposed to the sort of much more alienated and sort of individualizing culture we get a sense of in Shinbone. Also, that train you saw at the beginning and the train, especially the train you saw at the end, that's testimony to the power of John Ford. That particular part of Colorado where they filmed it doesn't have train tracks or a train. He just liked that scene, the background. So he had a train track built and he had a train brought in just for that 15 seconds you saw at the end of the movie. And it's effective because it is such a sad departure. As you see it leaving, you realize they're leaving behind any kind of possible truth in their marriage. I don't think she knows. And I think that little, she just raises her head a bit when she hears the man who shot Liberty Valance. She's sick of it. And sick of it in a way that means she thinks it's true, but enough already. They're both trapped by it.
I thought she knew.
Most people I talked to think she knew, yeah. But I have no way of arguing. It's just my hunch is that he's not the kind of man who would have told her. And that's the only way she would have known. But I'm a little hard on him, and a lot of people tell me, tone this down. He's a brave guy. Shut up about Rance.
So you make the point about the Jimmy Stewart character, in a sense, shooting Liberty, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because in the long run, he's the one who brings about the change in the city. But I think it's mostly just a comment. But when you said that, what I thought you were going to say is that because he had the personal courage to get out there that night, even though he was not himself capable of shooting that man, that because of his, personality, he was able to have the resources at his disposal, even though he didn't know it, to lead to the actual killing of that man.
Yeah.
I really like that.
Yeah, that's a good point. But like everything in the movie, it's complicated. I mean, you're certainly right, and it's a qualification on what I said about Rance. But then you try to ask yourself, well, why does he do this? I mean, he doesn't, it's not anything that derives from his commitment to law. What you saw at the beginning of the movie is rather naive. I don't want to kill you, I want to put you in jail. I'm a lawyer. As if that means anything in a world where the law doesn't have any teeth in it. So it's after Peabody is nearly killed in the beating by the Edmund O'Brien character, the drunk newspaper man, who is the most courageous person in the movie. He keeps printing this stuff about the ranchers over and over again, and after he's threatened and intimidated and finally beaten near to death by Liberty Valance. It's that and some sense you get that he would feel ashamed if he ran away. But that's in a way also giving in to what he doesn't believe in, that civilized code should be subject to these qualifications. You don't go into a street and shoot a man, is what he believes. But he's pulled into this in a way that indicates some kind of compromise with that. And I agree with you, in some sense that's admirable. But it also is an issue in what's the overall take the movie gives us on the problem of political civilized life and its relation to violence. It's very complicated, but it is certainly true. His personal courage is part of legend. He's willing to die for something, but it doesn't seem to be for the law.
What do you make of the collective's sheriff being essentially incompetent, and then the collective as such not being willing to collectively address the violence of Liberty Valance, because together they would certainly have the power to achieve their ends, or to achieve the ends of the Jimmy Stewart character?
Yeah, good point. I mean, it's not made much of in the movie the way it is in High Noon. In High Noon, at the beginning, they all do agree to be deputized. And they're all going to get up. I mean, there are only 3 outlaws. There are going to be 15 of them with rifles lining the street. And as soon as they start shooting at Gary Cooper, they're going to shoot them. But then one by one, they wimp out. They lose their courage. So that it's made a big issue. And I think in this, what we're supposed to assume is just Valance and his henchmen are too powerful, too terrifying. I mean, that's as sadistic a villain as exists in movies, willing to do anything. You're still right that if they had planned and gotten together, but these are not soldiers. They're grocers and bankers and ranchers and saloon keepers and small shopkeepers and something like that. So it's an interesting question. How much should we have expected of them? I mean, when this movie came out, John Wayne and Howard Hawks, John Wayne really basically never understood any of the movies he was in. He was, I have a friend who is a philosophy professor in Oregon, whose father was Robert Ryan, the great movie actor from the 40s. And his son, Cheney Ryan, is a philosopher, so I saw him at a conference, actually at a conference about my book that this is a part of. And he said his father told him that John Wayne was the nicest man, the kindest, most sensitive and sympathetic man he'd ever met, but the stupidest. And that John Ford was the meanest SOB he ever met, but the smartest. But John Wayne, when he saw the whole movie, was horrified. And he and Howard Hawks, who was also horrified, made Rio Bravo as a kind of counter to both it and High Noon. And at one point, the community in Rio Bravo goes to the sheriff, John Wayne, and Dean Martin of all people, Ricky Nelson. A lot of people like this movie. I think it's a little ridiculous. But anyway, they go to them and say, all right, we're going to help you. And then John Wayne gets to do what he wanted to do. He says, no, it's my job. I'm the sheriff. You're not fit for this. You're business people. I know how to do this. So there's a kind of response to this by Howard Hawks. But it's an interesting question. How much should we have expected of them? How much do we expect of ourselves in situations like this? We don't have a draft anymore, for example.
But I think part of it too is someone else would step up in Liberty Valance's place. Like that was the assumption.
Could be, yeah.
That the devil we know is better than the devil we don't know.
Mm-hmm. Could be. There are all sorts of rational ways of, and quite reasonable, prudent, of not getting into a fight with Liberty Valance or any of those people north of the picket wire. I think this is also why when she is, in a way, attributing indirectly to Rance responsibility for the civilizing of the town, when she's in the buckboard at the beginning and she makes a similar comment about how it was a heroic action of a couple of people that were responsible for all this, Link, the sheriff, Andy Devine, says, no, the railroad done that. In other words, what's coming is going to dwarf the power of the ranchers anyway. The railroad, industry, banking, commerce, large-scale transportation hubs. So there's something about John Wayne's willingness to participate in this that is an acknowledgement that his way of life is over. The way of life of these small, self-sufficient ranchers in the West. So it's also the case that looking for heroic partners in ridding the town of all of the ranchers' diabolical henchmen maybe is too narrow a focus because in a way the movie represents a kind of tide of history. that sweeps up these characters in it, and they perform heroically, but it's the tide that is eventually going to make the old shin bone the new shin bone, no matter what anybody does.
Were you implying there's some mythology in religion or politics built faith or nationalism?
Yeah, well, it's an interesting question. I mean, what do you think? I mean, we have national stories.
War, for example, is a bad kind of good.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it would be interesting. It would be interesting to. I come from the South, so I grew up in North Florida, which is as, you know, the further north in Florida you go, the souther you get, which is true. North Florida is basically like South Alabama and South Georgia. So when I was a child, and I think still today, the Civil War is not a dead issue. It's a live issue, the resentment at the Civil War and at Reconstruction. And there are alternate narratives, mythic narratives, about the war and the fight. They're not historical debates about accuracy. They're a clash of mythological narratives. And as you saw in High Noon as well, Westerns are often portrayed as kind of jingoistic, heroic, patriotic, kind of affirmative movies about American heroism. But many, many, many of the great Westerns have this terribly clouded and ambiguous reflection on our own past embodied in them. I mean, the most explicit is when Gary Cooper, in a way, in the ultimate demythologizing move, whatever we believe is false, takes it off and throws it on the ground. But at the end of Stagecoach, when John Wayne runs off with Dallas, the prostitute, to start a new life, the sheriff said, well, there's two more saved from civilization. That these civilizing narratives are largely delusions. So there's two questions. One, do we have them and do we still use them? I would say probably yes. Secondly, how reliable are they? Is it a good thing that we have them? That's an open question. That's a philosophical question. They want you on the mic for the recording.
Why does Tom Donovan make that line about cold-blooded murder as opposed to seeing it as justifiable homicide?
Any lawyers in the group? You're aware?
Yeah. The question, I mean, certainly in this day and age, you had somebody seeing somebody else about to be killed and intervene, there would at least be that defense. I almost see Tom Donovan's character as being very cocky, and it troubles me because I'm still questioning whether or not he actually killed Liberty Valance. How do we know, absent ballistics or anything like that? I mean, it's a big assumption that it wasn't Rance that did it.
Yeah, that is an interpretation of the movie. And I was predicting to somebody beforehand that sometime in the discussion it would come up, because one way of reading the scene is John Wayne's character, Tom Donovan, sees that, why I'm confusing the two, Ransom Stoddard is being crushed by this burden of guilt, that it's going to destroy his future life with Hallie, which is going to exist no matter what, and that it will prevent him from being a delegate to the convention. So he takes it on himself, even though it didn't happen. And I've even had people in audiences when I've given this talk go through elaborate geometric reconstructions of the angle, like a courtroom scene, you know, trying to prove that he couldn't have done it from there, given the way Liberty Valance fell over, and so I mean, maybe. I think the movie works as effectively as it does without that super subtle wrinkle. I think the movie is much more effective in what it wants to raise and present to us if it is mere legend that he shot Liberty Valance. On the first point about the law, you know better than I, but wouldn't it have been, I mean, as long as it didn't occur in Florida or one of these states with a stand your ground law, isn't he obligated at one point before he shoots to say, stop, or I'll shoot? He can't just, I mean, I don't know what the law is, but he can't just shoot, can he? He has to try to stop him first.
I guess it depends how quickly it happened.
Yeah, well, you know, Pompey throws the gun, 10 seconds maybe. He's got time to say, stop.
But there is no law.
True. Very good point.
One of the things that you didn't show, but I thought was really interesting, was how much Rance loves Tom Donovan, and when they're doing the nominating for the delegates, he nominates Tom Donovan first, and he talks about the heroism and that he's the kind of man that everybody would want in Washington. And then Tom Donovan says no, and says, I won't take it, and I'm going to nominate you instead. But he doesn't say the good things about Rance Stoddard in return,
right.
Although you know that they have, to me, they were kind of a yin and a yang, because Rance wants to be like Tom Donovan in a way, but he just feels like he has to be higher morals than Tom Donovan. And I think that Tom Donovan felt that way about him too. So to me, it was kind of like alter egos.
Yeah. What's the term now they use in Hollywood? A bromance? They have a kind of bromance going on under the table that neither one would be willing to admit. I think that's very true and very important. So I think you're right. The other, and it's sort of symbolically significant in the movie. You have Liberty Valance on one extreme, barbaric, unconstrained violence for any end. And you have Rance Stoddard on the other extreme, super civilized, believes in the law, disgusted by violence. And you have Tom Donovan, who sort of has a leg in both camps. He's not like Valance, but he's certainly not like Rance. And Rance is kind of pulled towards Tom. And part of it is a kind of admiration. I think you're quite right about Tom, which isn't quite reciprocated, because at least apart from that speech, because there's a scene, since it seems you've seen the movie, when he goes out to practice shooting, and Tom humiliates him, shoots a paint bucket, and he splatters him all full of paint, kind of foreshadowing of blood and a warning on how dangerous this is. The other thing I think that's interesting is the relationship between, in this regard, trying to figure out the Rance-Tom geometry with Hallie. Because with Tom, you sense a kind of smoldering, genuine passion, which you don't in Rance. He seems more interested in teaching her. And there's a hint of patronizing, I don't know what, not humiliation, but nevertheless a patronizing diminishment of Hallie in his relation to her that may explain something of the ending, when she has to, in effect, very quickly assess her whole life in that moment when he says, wouldn't you like to return? Maybe just as a trial balloon. And she said, oh, Rance, if you only knew how many times I've thought about coming back to this dinky little desert town. Not Washington, not London, not Paris. My roots are here. My heart is here. And then, you get this kind of stunned look on Rance's face. It makes you sort of think of the marriage as well as a kind of issue in this general theme, because it's such a civilized marriage, in a way, whereas the marriage with Tom would have been at least a little steamier, let's say.
This will be our last question.
This is absolutely fascinating. I'm really enjoying this lot. I'm wondering, you're talking about the movie and what Ford meant to say. How much did he talk about this, or is this something that has become, that's in there that we're taking away from it, or how much did he really need to put in there?
Yeah.
I'm just coming, I took many of the classes from Roger Ebert so long ago in Chicago, and I always remember him saying that one of the things when he talks to directors, and he says, what about this scene and that scene, and he said, I didn't even know I was doing that. And then the people who are watching it are attributing a lot more to it, which isn't wrong or right. It's just, I just wonder how much Ford talked about what he was trying to do with this.
Well, yeah, it's an important, very large issue about what the source of meaning in an art object is. How much is dependent on us constituting the meaning, how much is dependent on the intentions of the artist, and how much simply resides in the work apart from the intentions of the artist. A very complicated question. In Ford's case, he was notorious for giving false or misleading or no information about his relation to the film. He's like Robert Frost in a way. Whenever people would ask him about the film, he would give the stupidest answer possible to shut them up. But he was an extremely widely read man in European and American history, extremely literate, but in public always played the sort of drunken Irish know-nothing as a kind of role. So whatever he did say is completely unreliable. That's one thing. The second thing is artists very often, especially actors, when you ask, did he intend it? Well, there's a conscious verbal intention that they could formulate, and there's all kinds of intuitive insights that actors have. I mean, especially an actor like John Wayne, who is not a self-conscious or verbal actor, sometimes just gets these. There's a scene in The Searchers, which I think is the greatest film by Ford, and maybe the greatest film ever, when he constructs an expression that is so complicated, full of self-hatred, self-doubt, sadness, melancholy. There's just 1,000 things going on in his face. And you know, I'm sure what happened was they did 100 takes until he was so tired he wasn't thinking of anything anymore, and then Ford got exactly the right take. But if you ask Ford, why was that the right take? It may be the case that he could not give you an explanation. It just looked right. And that for me is enough to say, well, the intention doesn't have to be something self-consciously formulated and said or proven. It's in the film, but it's in the film in the way that maybe sometimes even the director doesn't realize or doesn't recognize. Mm-hmm.